I am waiting on the troublesome group sitting down. Well, good afternoon, everyone. And I see quite a few faces from yesterday and today, so I'm very grateful for those who are coming back. But I have to go through the same routine for those who are new, where I've got to pretend to be an air hostess. So if there is a fire at any stage, the exits are either side. If you need the services of the toilet, they're right at the back. And I would ask that you turn your phones off or at least silent. Not least because part of this session is going to be very different from previous sessions. When I was asked if I would design a program for Adam Smith, the easiest thing would have been to say, we'll have a session in economics and a session in philosophy. That's what everybody expects, and of course is important. And we've had a session on philosophy and a session in economics. But because he was, in my view, a great educator, not only as a professor who gave remarkable lectures to his students, but also through his writings, the opening session was in education. And I thought we need to get a sense of his influence more widely, beyond the worlds of academic philosophy and economics. And we need to get some insight into the society that he actually lived in. And that's why this afternoon is going to be quite different. We're going to start, it'll be with a lecture. We're going to have music, and we are going to have an understanding presented to us of the society of the time. So thank you very much for coming along. I would like to now hand over to the chairperson for this afternoon's session, Esther Robertson, who many of you will know is the chair of Fife Cultural Trust. Esther.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. And can I add my welcome to all of you this afternoon, especially on a sunny day. That's such a rare occasion in Fife at the moment, to give up your afternoon. But I think we can promise you an afternoon of education and entertainment. Can I also say a warm welcome to our four contributors. Professor Michael Brown is here, Elizabeth Thompson and Mark Rogers, who you'll hear from later, and from Billy Kay. And I'll say a bit more about each of them as I introduce them. But first, to set some context. As Roger said, he was asked if he would put together an academic programme for the Tercentenary. And when he asked if I would chair the event on culture, I was delighted to say yes. I want to say I'm a local girl, but I'm maybe kidding myself there as a local lass. But I grew up in East Weems, just 5 miles along the road from here, and Kircaldy was our closest town. We were regulars in the Adam Smith Theatre, at pantomimes and the like. And as I'm sure my colleagues on Fife, the Trust, are fed up hearing me say, I had my 21st birthday party in the Adam Smith Theatre. I was embarrassed to admit it until yesterday, when a gentleman in the audience at the education session asked a question, and he said, probably not much younger than I am, I grew up and was educated here in Kircaldy. How come I never heard anything in my education about Adam Smith? And I'm delighted to see that we've got Kircaldy High School here with a group of students who will be studying Adam Smith as part of their advanced higher in history. So things have at least moved on a bit. But like the gentleman yesterday, I knew little of anything. It was just the Adam Smith Theatre. Growing up again as an adult in the 80s and 90s, of course, we then saw the rise of the Adam Smith Institute promoting free market economics. And I assumed that Adam Smith was a staunch free marketer. Only more recently did I learn about how he really was a true lad of parts, and how he'd gone to university in Glasgow at 14 and had studied economics, moral philosophy, history. What I've read this week, which I thought was interesting, is that he's being claimed now by both the right and the left in politics. So I think we can probably agree he must have done something right. It's only in the last few weeks, though, since Roger invited me to chair this session, that I learned anything about Adam Smith's cultural interests. And given that he was a lad of parts and that he was interested in education, it's no surprise. And the quote I'll be taking away from this programme over the last couple of days, and people will tire of hearing me say it, I'm sure. Adam Smith said, "No society can surely be flourishing and happy, of which the far greater part of members are poor and miserable." And it's interesting because in the early part of the year, the Adam Smith Global Foundation had a lecture with Professor Sir Michael Marmot, who's a leading public health specialist and advises government, and he could as easily have used those very words. Adam Smith didn't believe in inequality, and he was absolutely committed to universal education and to the role of the arts in society. In his essays, he wrote about beauty, painting, sculpture, dance, poetry, and of course, music. He was familiar with and enjoyed the opera and also the works of Rabbie Burns, and it had never occurred to me that they were contemporaries. I understand because of Adam Smith's ill health in his later years, he never met Burns, but it's on record that he bought 4 copies of Burns' Edinburgh edition, so we know he was obviously a bit of a fan. So as Roger says, this afternoon we'll hear about his influence on literature and some of the types of music and song, and also about the language and the society he would have been exposed to. We won't be hearing music and song that is specifically connected to Adam Smith, but will be representative of the period. And we'll have 2 musical interludes, one which will focus mainly on the operatic, and the other which will be more focused on Burns. But first of all, can I introduce our first speaker, Professor Michael Brown. Michael's a professor of history at Aberdeen University. As you'll be able to tell, he doesn't speak the Doric, I don't think. He's a historian of Ireland, Scotland, and Britain. And Michael's particular interest is in the Enlightenment and in the political culture of the 18th century. He's going to explore for us his ideas of sympathy in language and Adam Smith's influence on culture and literature. So if you can please welcome Professor Michael Brown.
Thanks very much indeed, Esther. That was very kind of you. And thanks to Roger for the invitation to come and speak and for helping organise things. Well, it's been a tremendous event, I'm sure you'll agree. This is kind of a slightly unusual talk. I'll talk for about half an hour. I'm going to take Adam Smith as a starting point to talk about the influence he's had in various other areas, and particularly around the novel in the late 18th, early 19th century. And this ended up with me kind of subtitling either Adam Smith amongst women or, more to the point, Jane Austen and zombies, but we'll get there. Okay, Adam Smith is not famous for his cultural views. He did not write a novel, and he was not a poet, that we know. Nor did he express a fashionable interest in antiquarianism, for example, although he was deeply interested in history. By reputation, his concern was with what the Marxist tradition later termed the economic base, the world of factories, paper mills, and coal mines. Not that of a cultural superstructure, the world of newsprint, raucous squibs, and scandalous libels, nor that, indeed, of salon sophisticates, of philosophical speculations and ironic detachment from matters of concern. That was the world his friend David Hume inhabited, and one, it seems, from which Smith at times kept a studied distance. He seemed uncomfortable in some ways in that polite society, yet he does act as an impartial spectator upon it. Where Smith does intrude on matters of aesthetic concern, it was to do with his professional capacity as a public educator. In 1748-9, when he was just back from Oxford and desperately looking for a job, he delivered a series of lectures on rhetoric and belles lettres to a general audience. People paid in the door to go and hear him tell them how to reflect on literature. Successful in this, he repeated them for a further 2 years. He then returned to the subject while chair of moral philosophy at Glasgow, and he gave a lecture course on the subject from 1751 to 1763. Now, rhetoric for Smith was all about clarity of expression, and crucially, the communication of sympathy. How you felt, your expression of how you feel towards the world, and their expression back about how they feel back to you. Unpublished in his lifetime, his views are by no means as influential as that of his contemporary, Hugh Blair, whose 1783 lectures under the same title arguably helped create the discipline of English literary criticism. And it is only student notes by which the lectures have survived. And if any of us have ever seen some of the notes our students take at lectures, we have a fair idea of just how inaccurate and crazed they happen to be. The prose here that has come down to us is unfortunately drained of much of the illumination and anecdote that makes his finest passages sparkle like granite in the rain. We were hearing a lot about that this morning. Moreover, Smith can be seen as caught between two distinct approaches to literature. Placing his course within the university setting, as he did, associates him with a modern turn towards what Robert Crawford has provocatively termed the Scottish invention of English literature, his argument being that Scots basically standardise and structure an English literary course. Right? This institutionalization of the study of a set of modern classics for their imaginative reach and emotional depth is something he clearly identifies with this late 18th, early 19th century turn. Now, this is a romantic mode of appropriation. However, when Smith actually turns to literary analysis, when he looks at texts, he's a particular fan of Swift, I have to say in passing, he's much less celebratory of contemporary modern literature than he was inclined towards rehearsing the value of ancients. Here he seems to write in a much more Renaissance mode of rhetoric. In fact, as Mark Selber Phillips has made clear, Smith was adopting a third approach, one which briefly flourished in the 18th century and which prioritized the emotional affect of literature. For Smith, reading and literature was to be valued because it connected the emotional state of the author with that of the reader. It's a moment of emotional connection. But this intersubjective approach waned quickly into the 19th century with the emphasis on authorial inspiration and a view of the author as a kind of creator of worlds. And that left many of Smith's opinions looking very badly dated or idiosyncratic. So, why then take Smith and culture as a topic at all? Worthy of reflection, indeed, on an occasion as august as this. And I'd like to posit that while he was renowned as a political economist, the heft of this intellectual achievement has overshadowed something else which Smith might lay some intellectual claim to, namely the creation of a culture of sympathy and moral reflection that shaped Britain then and indeed now. And to show how this might be so, I want to turn to the theory of moral sentiments, his other great work, and two moments in two foundational works which might be suggestive of my wider claim, namely Jane Austen's Emma of 1816 and Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, 1818, Jane Austen and zombies. But in both cases, I've got to begin by reflecting upon sin. Always wanted to say that in a church. Smith's concept of sin is not as straightforward as it might appear. He was notoriously private about his religious views and fretted for his more outspoken friend, Hume, even if his biographer, Nicholas Phillipson, is correct to assume that they both shared a set of skeptical assumptions about matters of the divine. Hume was a notorious free thinker, arguably an atheist, and Smith seems to have shared many of those ideas. But if indeed this is the case, and Smith was disinclined to speculation on the otherworldly, his views on this worldly affairs was still temperamentally in keeping with his upbringing in the sturdy Presbyterianism of the merchant community of his hometown. In particular, in his moralizing, in both senses of the term, Smith kept very chaste indeed. His theory of moral sentiments can, I think, be read as a careful guide to the acquirement of social pleasure and the avoidance of immoderate vice. The entire work revolves around the issue of how actions are perceived and understood in a social setting, what we think of other people, frankly, and how to model virtuous conduct in a social setting. In other words, making certain that they think the right things of us. Sin here is transmogrified into antisocial behavior. And one of the most antisocial of vices, for reasons I hope will become clear, is that of personal pride. The proud man is sincere, Smith propounds, and in the bottom of his heart he is convinced of his own superiority. He wishes you to view him in no other light than that in which, when he places himself in your situation, he really views himself. He demands no more of you than what he thinks justice. If you appear not to respect him as he respects himself, he is more offended than mortified, and feels the same indignant resentment as if he has suffered a real injury. In other words, if you don't think as highly of him as he thinks of himself, he takes that as a personal slight. That's the definition of pride. Pride here can lead you to being dismissive of people around you and to pursuing your own convictions and obsessions in the false conviction of your own self-worth and significance. As Smith further observes, the proud man disdains to court your esteem. He affects even to despise it and endeavors to maintain his assumed station, not so much by making you sensible of his superiority as by making you sensible of your meanness. Now, in this way, pride is powerfully disruptive of social connection. Smith writes of how his sense of his own dignity renders him, the proud man, careful to preserve his independence, and remarks on how the proud man does not always feel himself at his ease in the company of his equals, and still less of his superiors. Nothing worse for a proud man than finding himself amongst people who are better than him in the first place. And it's from this observation that we can begin here to make the case that in supplying a moral philosophy that's centered on sociability and disdains the sin of pride, Smith was to be highly influential on the culture of Regency Britain. Now, this leads me to my first vignette, and there are two, so you'll know where I am in this argument. Emma Woodhouse was picnicking with her friends on Box Hill. Now, despite the fineness of the day, which is declared to be something like the one we're experiencing here, there was a languor, a want of spirit, a want of union, which could not be got over. They, her friends, separated too much into parties. They all split off into little groups. This factionalism irritated Emma, for whom the event was being marked by a downright dullness, and finding her companions Harriet Smith and Frank Churchill both insufferable. Finally deciding to idle the hours away by flirting with Churchill, Emma teases that his behaviour is only sociable as he is now under command. Your command, he asks. Yes, he replies. Perhaps, Emma responds, I intended to say so, but I meant self-command. In other words, I'm telling you how to behave, and he's saying, I'll make it my own behaviour. Now, this exchange sets up the theme of self-control and social decorum. They then turn to disparage the 7 others on the trip, with Churchill whispering, our companions are exceedingly stupid, pride, before asking them to reveal what they are all silently thinking about. When Emma protests that she does not wish to know what they are pondering, even greater pride, couldn't be bothered thinking what you guys are up to, Mrs. Elton argues that it would be improper to pry. Yet Churchill changes tack, asking them instead to provide Emma with something entertaining. She only demands, he says, from each of you one thing very clever, be it prose or verse, original or repeated, of 2 things, or 2 things moderately clever, or 3 things very dull indeed. And she engages to laugh heartily at all of them. Here's the key moment. Oh, very well, exclaimed Miss Bates, then I don't need to be uneasy. 3 things very dull indeed. That will just do for me, you know. I shall be sure to say 3 things dull as soon as I ever open my mouth, shan't I? Looking around with the most good-humoured dependence on everyone's assent. She's asking for people to sympathise. Do you not think I shall? Emma could not resist. Ah, madam, there may be a difficulty, she says. Pardon me, but will you be limited as to number? Only 3 at once. Now, this brutal put-down, suggesting that Miss Bates is interminably dull, breaks the rules of self-command to which the earlier conversation with Churchill alluded, all that stuff about self-control. And the target very soon spots the breach. For Miss Bates, deceived by the mock ceremony of her manner, did not immediately catch her meaning, writes Austen. But when it burst on her, it could not anger, though a slight blush showed that it could pain her. She gets hurt. She turns to Knightley and reflects, I will try and hold my tongue. I must make myself very disagreeable, or she would not have said such a thing to such an old friend. Now, in this moment, the demands of decorum and decency have been set aside, and in acting this way, Emma has revealed herself to be self-important and careless, supercilious and callous. And it's the moment of her reckoning in the novel. Ultimately, Emma's social blunder is recovered by an admission of error and a recalculation of her own frailties and value. She is saved by her ability to listen to Knightley and take his admonition as a friend seriously. Knightley's the only one she listens to in the novel. In this way, Knightley acts as both her social conscience and her benevolent benefactor. And that places him in the position of impartial spectator to Emma's social actor, providing an undercurrent of judgment on her behaviour. And in acting as that impartial spectator, Knightley earns Emma's love. Virtue is here being understood by Austen as reciprocal, as social, and as interpersonal. And it's worth noticing how this plot twist, and Jane Austen is really good at plot twists, hinges on the social impropriety of Emma's dismissal of Miss Bates. As Knightley squarely puts it to her, were she a woman of fortune, I would leave every harmless absurdity to take its chance. I would not quarrel with you for any liberties of manner. Were she your equal in situation? But Emma, consider how far this is from being the case. She is poor, she has sunk from the comforts she was born to, and if she lives to an old age, must probably sink more. Her situation should secure your compassion. It was badly done indeed, he concludes. Now, this is akin to a sermon. We are in a church. This is akin to a sermon on Smith's intersubjective moral schema, with Emma being reminded of the different social conditions of Miss Bates and herself, and the demands for tolerance and understanding that places upon her. She is a social superior, so she has to show generosity. And her sin is one founded in pride and expressed through social impropriety. And propriety was arguably possibly even the central concern of the theory of moral sentiments. Now, to make sense of why, it's necessary to briefly sketch out the basis of Smith's moral system. Now, this is illustrated very early on in a famed illustration. Just as in The Wealth of Nations, where the idea of the division of labour is beautifully explained through reference to a pin factory, here in the earlier work, Smith provides a memorable tableau to explore his basic ideas. He writes of how a man suffering torture on a rack can be witnessed by a well-meaning bystander. Now, in this moment, two distinct ethical imperatives come into play. For the one suffering the pain of punishment, the demand is made to lessen his expression of distress. No, don't mind me, I'm fine. This is all okay. I'm used to it, it's good. This is to ensure that he doesn't upset and emotionally distress the onlooker. However, and that's the Stoic ethos of acceptance, by the way. However, the witness needs to alleviate the suffering, reaching out to the pained prisoner in an expression of Christian charity. Are you okay? You sure you're okay? You don't mind at all, right? So there's dialogue going on. In Emma's case, she's being reminded by Knightley of the Christian duty to express liberal generosity towards a suffering Stoic, Miss Bates. Oh, of course I'm dull. I'm the sort of person that people don't find socially fun to be around. Yet for both the Stoic and the Christian, in this case, propriety is the overriding moral imperative. Miss Bates continues to model this value, both in suggesting initially that she is aware of her own dull conversation, and then taking the admonishment as well as she can. Knightley tells Emma she felt your full meaning. She has talked of it since. I wish you could have seen how she talked of it. With what candour and generosity. I wish you could have heard her honouring your forbearance in being able to pay such attention to her when her society must be so irksome. Now, Emma, in contrast, seeks to defend herself and needs to be recalled to her duty by Knightley, leaving her tearfully ultimately to reflect on her social misstep. Propriety, then, is crucial to Smith's ethical framework. Daniel B. Klein has nicely observed of how the reader of the theory of moral sentiments finds that a sense of propriety operates in every sympathy. Since Smith holds that all moral sentiments relate to a sympathy, that means all moral sentiments involve a sense of propriety. Excavating what Smith implied by this use of this term, Klein then argues that Smith designates propriety as the appellation for the fair to middling region between praiseworthiness and blameworthiness. Conduct that exceeds propriety, if you do well, is praiseworthy, and conduct that falls short of propriety is deemed blameworthy. Propriety itself, it's just okay. It's what the society will expect of you. Importantly, the nature of this adequate behavior, as we have seen, depends on the personal circumstances of the individual making those moral decisions. It also changes depending on the nature of the moral community in which they are part. So it's different if you're in one set of social arrangements over another. You behave differently at school than you do with your friends or with your parents, right? Society changes the kinds of demands that it makes on you. It also changes depending on the position you hold in that society. Are you the captain of the football team, or are you merely a sub? How are you meant to behave depends on your position in the hierarchies in which you find yourself. And finally, it varies depending on the position they hold in that society. Sorry, Smith then writes, for example, it varies depending on the position that you hold within the society writ large. Smith writes quite pointedly about how the grief of a parent at the death of a young man might be openly and expressed in a way which would be unpardonable, he writes, in a general at the head of an army, when glory, the public safety, demands so much a great part of his attention. So in other words, the role that you've taken up in the society will depend on the expression of the emotion that you have. Now, as Klein realizes, this helps us to make sense of how, for example, a great composer might not be reckoned to be a great man. His virtue in the first office may not be sustained when the perspective is widened to encompass all of his moral callings. It allows human beings to be complicated. And that's one of the great achievements of Smith, I think. It's one of the reasons we continue to read him and find him fascinating. This leads Klein to further observe that the moral decisions involve a calculation concerning how different virtues, courage and justice, for example, might contradict each other. We are now in a realm of competing passions and competing goods. Now, in describing all of these virtues, Smith spends time reflecting upon magnanimity. When confronted with Miss Bates's self-deprecating observation, Emma ought to have rejected her friend's low self-valuation. No, you're never boring, right? That's the line she should be taking. Instead, she indulges it. Miss Bates's magnanimity in the face of misfortune was not reciprocated by Emma. It's this virtue, then, which Emma decidedly lacks in her exchange with Miss Bates, and the propriety of her behavior is therefore found wanting. Guilty of social arrogance or pride, she is recalled to the norms expected of her, place and station, by Knightley's carefully managed criticism, and for calling her back to her moral duty, she finds love. Now that social pride produces this kind of social discord through forms of impropriety is, I think, one of the central themes of Jane Austen's novels, from the aptly named Pride and Prejudice, I had to go there, right, to its counterpoint, Sense and Sensibility. Think how Darcy's behavior is misread by Elizabeth Bennet in the first of these novels, her prejudicial rendering of his actions as prideful, having to be corrected when she attacks his propriety and is sharply criticized in turn. Or how, in the earlier work, Sense and Sensibility, the fate of Eleanor and Marion Dashwood is tested and twisted around issues of social decorum and honour, being exercised by the rakish Willoughby, the upstanding Edward Ferrars, and the worthy Colonel Brandon. In each case, the story's tensile energy comes from the characters' need to maintain social decorum while managing the demands of their own false sense of self-worth and the worth of others. It's endless exposition of calculation of social norms. The calculus of propriety and the relationship between true worth and social recognition are, I think, in constant play. And in this sense, they are fables in a Smithian mode. That's not the only way, though, that Smith's careful moral calculations might become unbalanced. If Emma's fault was to disregard others, that of Victor Frankenstein was to overestimate himself. Now, this leads me to my second vignette. It's one of the most famous scenes in Gothic literature, and as a result, it's hard to say anything very novel about it. Yet it seems to me the moment of creation, when Frankenstein's monster is given life, deserves, at least in this context, another look. It comes at the beginning of chapter 4. Victor recalls the following. It was a dreary night of November that I beheld the accomplishment of my toils. With an anxiety that almost amounted to agony, I collected the instruments of life around me, that I might infuse a spark of being into the lifeless thing that lay at my feet. It was already 1 a.m. The rain pattered dismally against the panes, and my candle was nearly burnt out, when by the glimmer of the half-extinguished light, I saw the dull yellow eye of the creature open. It breathed hard, and a convulsive motion agitated its limbs. Now, this is commonly read as a fable of the overreach of the modern scientific method, the moment in which the natural philosopher, instead of trying to reveal the nature of God, looks to become God. But once the moment has been described, Shelley subtly alters the perspective. The next paragraph, largely taken up with a physical description of the creature, opens with Victor asking himself, how can I define my emotions at this catastrophe, portending the drama to follow, rather than the excursions which have just passed? Note here, as with the previous passage, just how the paragraph revolves around the repeated use of the personal pronoun. I had worked hard for nearly 2 years for the sole purpose of infusing life into an inanimate body. For this, I had deprived myself of rest and health. I had desired it with an ardor that far exceeded moderation. But now that I had finished, the beauty of the dream vanished, and the breathless horror and disgust filled my heart. Unable to ensure the aspect of the being I had created, I rushed out of the room and continued a long time traversing my bedchamber, unable to compose my mind to sleep. Each sentence here works to identify Victor as the central actor in the emotional drama. It's not about the monster, it's about what the monster does to him. Right? This is all about me. That's the moment of pride. This passage is entirely prideful and filled with the sin of self-regard. It is that which energizes Victor's intellectual exploration and that which brings the small society in which he lives to its doom. Unlike Emma Woodbridge, then, the nature of Victor Frankenstein's pride is grounded not in social standing, but in intellectual accomplishment. Happening upon the works of Cornelius Agrippa, Victor embarks on a career as a kind of mad autodidact, reading his way through the works of the alchemical tradition. Here we go again. I read and studied the wild fancies of those writers with delight. They appeared to me treasures known to few beside myself. And although I wished to communicate the secret stores of knowledge to my father, yet his indefinite censure of my favorite Agrippa always withheld me. I disclosed my discoveries to Elizabeth, his sister, therefore under the promise of strict secrecy. But she did not interest herself in the subject, and I was left by her to pursue my studies alone. Now, in this way, his intellectual ambition, his pride, distances him from his most intimate society, even before its outcome physically destroys it. The monster goes about killing people. And when he reaches the University at Ingolstadt, the pattern repeats itself. Initial enthusiasm is doused with modern scientific discourse until he finds a mentor and throws himself into a community of natural philosophers. However, he concludes his studies and intends to return home only to find that he suddenly has a spark of inspiration, out of which he then explores by himself the studies that lead to the creation of the monster. In other words, Victor is wrapped up with questions of intellectual pride. All of this work swirls around his own experiences and responses. It reflects his deepening separation from the norms of human sociability and sets him apart even from the men of genius as he claims to be superseding them. He writes of how he explores graveyards to find the materials of which to make the monster, setting him out from the norms of human society. Now, this is intellectual pride and hubris, and it's blameworthy impropriety in Smith's terms. For this moral failing, of course, Frankenstein pays a heavy price. The monster rampages through Victor's connections and strips him of both kith and kin. His young brother, his friend, and his wife die at the hands of the creature, and the father dies from grief. He is then fated to chase the monster across the globe, forever separated from the communities he's encountered, only at the end of his life finding some small solace in recounting to his story to an English adventurer. This is the text that we then hold. Walton, the English adventurer, himself has lamented his own social dislocation to letters from his sister. So we have two social loners coming together in the novel. So this then, I think, in Frankenstein, is a Smithian fable precisely about how humans are pack animals. They gather, they congregate, they communicate in groups and find worth, meaning, and virtue through social intercourse. In breaking away from this through an act of intellectual pride, he brings the society from which he emerges to destruction. So, to conclude, what's at stake in both of these vignettes is, it seems to me, more than propriety, however. The failure of Emma Woodbridge and Victor Frankenstein to accord with the demands of social etiquette threatens them with a condition the 19th century comes to know as alienation, a condition that's actually experienced by Frankenstein's monster. This condition is, as Shelley depicts it, twofold. First, the monster is bereft of society. It is too hideous to engage with humanity, which it scares, and through Frankenstein's intransigence is left without female companionship of its own kind. Second, and just as significantly, the monster is unable to acknowledge its own origin story. Frankenstein has created it without a childhood and without a history. It is thus at once alienated from society and self-alienated. In this, it exemplifies the fears expressed in the pages of The Wealth of Nations about how modern society can disconnect humans from each other and from themselves. And it's this legacy of capitalist critique that Marx ultimately comes to illuminate in his early writings, recognizing how Smith had a cultural worry about capitalism, even as he celebrated its achievement in wealth generation. Now, for Smith, of course, the route past this danger is to be found through moral education. He was a moral philosopher, twinning his early work as a professor with his later time as an excise officer. But as both Austen and Shelley were aware, pride still threatened the social settlement of Regency Britain, even after it prevailed over the democratic enthusiasms of the French Revolution and the dictatorial conceit of the Napoleonic age. And the monster, as cultural critics have long recognized, still haunts the outskirts of our own imagination. Hubris and pride are present in our everyday anxieties, from the prideful possibilities of intellectual overreach that inform concerns about the destructive possibilities inherent in artificial intelligence, to worries about bystander society and the social breakdown found in emptying urban centres. Smith's moral insight continues, I think, to shape our cultural repertoire. So what then can we conclude about Smith's cultural influence? It's less that his Wealth of Nations helps us to understand the economic base on which the cultural superstructure is erected. Rather, I want to propose that in The Theory of Moral Sentiments, Smith points us towards both the social observations of Austen and the Gothic speculations of Shelley. And inasmuch as the 19th century was a conversation between the realist and the supernatural, think here of somebody like Dickens, Smith could give us a shared meaning of expressing these concerns. His work informs us of the mores and manners of the bourgeoisie, the fear and isolation of the mob, and it tells us of the anxiety about scientific advancement and the stripping of nature of the enchantments of faith. To bring us to our own moment, in Austen's Emma Woodbridge, we see the problems of arrogance that infest celebrity culture and its presumption of superiority and sense of entitlement. In the distress of Frankenstein's monster, we can read the improper frustrations of a burgeoning incel culture. And Smith can be read in the light of our current worries about being cancelled for social impropriety and our fears that social media aids and abets intellectual narcissism. It makes us reflect on the place of pride in our own society and the ways it works to erode connection and dissolves moral sympathy. And in that sense, at least, we continue to live in the cultural afterglow of Smith's moral imagination. Thanks very much.
What did you have to say? Thank you. We've got a few minutes before we move to any questions. To say, I didn't come expecting to hear about Jane Austen and Frankenstein in the same lecture, so that's been absolutely fascinating. If anyone has any questions, if they can show their hand and someone will come with a microphone. Microphone's on its way.
That was tremendously good.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. As a fan of Smith and Austen, and now I'm going to reread Frankenstein in your light. Do you have any opinion about Jane's knowledge of the works of Smith? It has been established that the theory of moral sentiments and the wealth of nations were in her father's library. But as a close student of these matters, do you see any evidence that she actually read either of these books? I don't think it matters that much. It's not a crucial question to the case that you're making, but interesting.
I think part of the neat way out of that is to say that it's part of the intellectual armory of people at that time, right? So she'll certainly have read people like Henry Mackenzie, the novelist, who's informed by Smith and is creating this sympathetic culture, this idea of human beings as basically driven by sympathy. So there's that side to it. And she reads Gothic novels, and we know that too. So there's that filter in. I think there's a slightly harder argument that I've seen made, that some of the language is drawing on kind of Smitherian rhetoric, particularly around this question of propriety. She's been reading a study called Pride and Profit, which is about how certain ideas, including the impartial spectator and so on, inform part of the structures of Austen's writing. How hard an argument, direct line you can make, it's much harder to tell. But I don't think it's necessary to the kind of argumentation that we're talking about here. Part of what's involved is thinking about the culture of sympathy that was being generated and the ways in which Smith is informing this precisely around ideas of propriety and decent civil behavior. And I think that's something that both Austen and Shelley are deeply concerned with in their different iterations.
Time for perhaps one more. Gentleman over in the corner.
Very much for such an interesting discussion. I was listening to you, and I'm afraid I'm a little like Jane Austen, expected readers to be and rather find Emma Woodhouse rather tedious. And so I was thinking of Fanny Price and Mansfield Park, and also thinking about Smith as an abolitionist. And of course, there is a strong abolitionist streak running through Mansfield Park. Is this I'm just wondering how we might relate the idea of sympathy, which is very much about social obligation in Emma, to the larger political ideas of sympathy, which we see in Mansfield Park.
Thanks for that. It's easier to answer directly in relation to Smith, right? I think part of the argument Smith is raking around abolition is that that by maintaining chattel slavery, we are losing the richness of treating people properly. That dealing with people as equals, in that sense at least, right? There is a social hierarchy which Smith accepts, but in diminishing their humanity through chattel slavery, we are also losers. And he talks about the distortion effect that that has on those who choose to enslave, as much as he's worried about the actual effect on those who are enslaved. And I think that's part of his constant reflection backward and forward. There was a talk this morning about the ways in which the whole of the empire becomes problematic to him because he thinks of it effectively as a kind of set of vested interests and factions that are running, that are misshaping British politics. And I think the ultimate outcome of that is by dehumanizing people, you're losing the capacity for human sympathy at all. And that will diminish the person who is doing this and their capacity to be human as much as it's dehumanizing the person they're treating. And I think that's where sympathy and abolition connect up in his mind. I think in the case of Austen, I'd have to look more closely on it. It's not a novel I know well, but the abolitionist streak, I think, is running along similar lines. The part of the problem is this, it sounds trite, but an awful lot of what the 18th century abolitionist movement was partly trying to make a case for is the distorting effect of chattel slavery on the politics of Britain itself. It was one way they got leverage into a political discussion. Leaving aside the moral argument about it per se, they had to find a mechanism to talk about why chattel slavery was a bad thing for Britain too, and that was one of the ways in which they found to do so. It's one of a variety of rhetorics they used to make the moral case that slavery is utterly unacceptable. I hope that helps answer.
Another fascinating angle to end that section on, and some pretty clear parallels with some of what we see today, but we'll talk about that another time, I'm sure. We're going to have a very brief pause because we need to reorientate the camera before I introduce Elizabeth and Mark. Can you give me a nod, someone, when we're ready to go? For those of you that weren't aware, it's not just being sound recorded, it is actually being filmed. And once there's been a serious edit, and clearance with all the presenters, the recordings will go public for people. So those will be available. Just talk amongst yourselves briefly. Okay, thank you very much for your patience, everyone. It's my pleasure now to introduce the first set of songs, and I'm delighted that we're joined by two very distinguished young professional musicians. Elizabeth Thompson, who studied first of all at the Royal Northern College of Music and then went on to do her Masters at the Guildhall. Elizabeth, a soprano who has sung with the London Symphony Orchestra and with Opera Rara in the Queen Elizabeth Hall. I was given one or two of the names of the operas and the parts that she'd performed, but given that they were all in Italian, I decided I wouldn't even attempt to describe them. And for this afternoon, Elizabeth is being accompanied by her colleague Mark Rogers on piano, and he came from the States to study at the Royal Conservatoire here in Glasgow, here in Scotland, in Glasgow, and then also went on to study at the Guildhall. So I think, as I mentioned earlier, this is a set that will include operatic music, not directly connected to Adam Smith, but from the time. And I'm delighted to welcome Elizabeth and Mark. So.
And welcome again to this afternoon session. Thank you very much for having us. As Esther mentioned, we're going to be focusing mostly on operatic arias for the first section. So we'll be seeing things from Mozart and Beethoven, who were composing, and the operas were being premiered at the time of Adam Smith's life. And then a segue into this next section by Billy is a Robert Burns song. But we'll begin with Giunse al fin il momento from La Nozze di Figaro. Giunse al fin e contrasse fanno il braccio all'idol mio. Uscite dal mio petto a turbarlo la verità dell'uomo risponda. La notte forte risponda. Oh, gioia bella, mia morte vergogna bella, finché splende un cielo turna pace. Finché l'aria ancor brucia, qui morrà il cui cielo scherza l'ora, ci sussurrò il corista. Poi fiorenti mai pressa, ai piaceri d'amor cui tutta resta. Vieni, tra queste piante ascose, vieni. Ti vola fronte in corona di rose. Ti vola fronte in corona in corona aria was written by Beethoven, his one and only opera, Fidelio. And the last operatic piece before the Burns is going to be another from Mozart, from his opera Die Zauberflöte, Pamina's aria, Accius. Haven and the king was from Largo and the rest of the day. Hey, kafro, for we, hey, what will do? Hey, kafro, for we, hey, what will do? We have sights to see, we have pennies to spend, and we have pints to bring. Hey, kafro, for we, hey, what will do? Hey, kafro, for we, hey, what will do? Hey,
everybody else, but that was an unexpected treat. Thank you so much, Elizabeth and Mark, and we look very much forward to hearing the next set. I'm now checking with Roger. Do we need a pause for the camera? No. Right. The next speaker, I think, probably needs no introduction. I'm sure everybody in the hall is well aware of Billy Kay, an author and broadcaster, and an expert and a passionate advocate for the Scots language. And as a wee plug, if you haven't noticed, some of his books are for sale at the front door. But I'm looking forward to hearing what Billy has to say to us today when he gives us an account of the linguistic and cultural milieu of the 18th century, and particularly looking at links between Scotland and Europe, and in particular between Kircaldy and the east coast of Scotland to Europe. Even better still. So Billy, welcome.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I'll just sort out some water first. First of all, thanks for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be back in Kircaldy. My mother was a miner's daughter from Bowhill, Cardenden, nearby. Although we lived in Ayrshire, we were often through here on holiday. I don't recall my Fife family quoting Adam Smith, but that other Fifer who also became an icon of international capitalism, Andrew Carnegie, was often cited by my mother in reply to me asking, I thought quite reasonably, for more pocket money. What do you think I am, son? Andrew Carnegie? And that was a common expression in my house growing up. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a privilege to be here to honour the legacy of a Scotsman of genius. What I'd like to do is give you some impressions of the cultural milieu Smith inhabited and inherited. 18th century Scotland was a country thranged with political tensions. The unpopularity of the Union itself, delivered by an aristocratic parliament, where many were bribed. Two Jacobite risings, the Friends of the People, the United Scotsmen, and slightly later in 1820, you had the Radical Rising, when men like Baird and Hardy were executed by the British state for demanding reform. One of the banners carried by the Straven weavers in that conflict was the old Covenanter saltire from the late 17th century with the words, Scotland free or a desert. But if the country was politically divergent, it was culturally still very Scottish. There's a great quote in my book, Knee Deep in Claret, about Jacobite songs being sung from one end of the high street in Edinburgh to another by staunch Hanoverians who simply loved the vigour of the Scots song in spite of the political messages they conveyed. The same Jacobites and Hanoverians in their clubs and houfs, Adam Smith was a member of the Oyster Club, for example, were happy to drink French claret, which had linked Scotland and France so closely it was called the bloodstream of the Auld Alliance, even though they knew it was smuggled illegally against the wishes of the state. John Home, a friend of David Hume, summed up the Scottish national position perfectly in this rhyme. Firm and erect the Caledonian stood. Old was his mutton and his claret good. Let them drink port, the English statesman cried. He drank the poison and his spirit died. 18th century Scotland was very much a trilingual country, Scots, Gaelic, and English. But where English was read and written, but rarely spoken, so that the English that was written was markedly different from English written by native speakers. When Lord Mansfield commented to Alexander Carlyle, who was like Smith a member of the Select Society, his feeling that he wasn't reading English in the works of Hume and Robertson, the sage of Inveresk gave this perceptive reply. To every man bred in Scotland, the English language was in some respects a foreign tongue, the precise value and force of whose phrases he didn't understand, and therefore was continually endeavouring to word his expressions by additional epithets or circumlocutions, which made his writing appear both stiff and redundant. The Scots literati had as yet mastered only the surface level of English, a detached register devoid of emotional resonance. They wrote English perfectly, in the same way as, for example, a German intellectual who'd similarly become fluent in the language and mastered its structures and surface would have done. Ironically, this very foreignness of English written by Scots, with its painstaking, precise correctness and formality, made it a perfect medium for discussing science and philosophy, in whose various branches the men of the Scottish Enlightenment excelled. But in his autobiography, which spans the years 1722 to 1805, Carlyle of Inveresk related how he had been taught a tolerable accent of English by his aunt from London, an accomplishment which in those days was very, very rare. His journal details the life of the Scottish community in London, in particular their frequenting of the British coffee house, the London Scots' favourite rendezvous. English was desired by the Scots, but for many it remained an impenetrable jargon. In one incident in 1758, Carlyle asks fellow Scot, Dr. Charles Congleton, what he thinks of the English now he's been among them for a few months. He replies that he's unable to reply honestly, as he has not really made acquaintance with any of them. I never enter into conversation with the John Bulls, he said, for to tell you the truth, I don't yet well understand what they say. Carlyle knew Smith and many of the leading men of the Enlightenment, such as William Robertson, principal of Edinburgh University, whom he recalled spoke broad Scotch in point of pronunciation and accent or tone. His was the language of literature and taste, and of an enlightened, liberal mind. The great geologist James Hutton, Sir Walter Scott, and many others continued speaking Scots as their natural everyday language long after the fashion for Augustan elegance had abated. The 20th century dramatist Robert McClellan portrays the problem beautifully in his play The Floors of Edinburgh, set in the period in an Auld Reekie awash with Anglicisation. In this short scene, a Scottish Augustan poet, Mr. Dowie, the Scots word for sad, Mr. Dowie, is just being disabused of the notion that he writes English with propriety by young Charles, who's returned from London, speaking a strangulated bourg of a pronunciation he insists is London English. This is an extract from the play. Charles, here we are, I think, Doctor, yes, you're sitting among the skulls addressing death. You say, thy bony hand lies chill upon my breast. Now add my carcase to thy loathsome feast, Dowie. Breast, no breast. Charles, I know it has to read breast before it rhymes, but an Englishman says breast, Dowie. B-R-E-A-S-T, Charles. Yes, Dowie. Breast, Charles. No, breast. Dowie. An Englishman says breast for B-R-E-A-S-T, Charles. Yes, Doctor. Have you ever been to England? Dowie. No. Charles, I thought so. English as a speaking language is quite foreign to you. Dowie. But I read nothing else. Charles, I said as a spoken language. You cannot possibly know how English words should sound. You have no right to write English poetry. Dowie, nae right. Do they say that in London? Charles, Englishmen say that. Dowie, dear me, a lot of my rhymes are wrong then. Charles, a considerable number. Dowie, dear me. Dr. Dowie is racked to the core of his existence by this revelation, but his type persisted and went to even greater lengths to acquire bon ton. In the Scottish capital, a roaring trade for those practicing the new science of elocution was available. In the 1760s, hordes of out-of-work actors and linguistic eccentrics flocked to Edinburgh to teach English. Among their pupils were men who in their saner moments were that brilliant coterie of Enlightenment intellectuals who made Edinburgh one of the cultural capitals of Europe at this time. Adam Smith's friend David Hume was so embarrassed by what he considered to be his inability to speak or write perfect English that when he died, he is said to have confessed not his sins, but his Scotticisms. With Hume, it appeared to be an idée fixe to out-English the English. He's said to have sent his manuscripts to such diverse experts as a linen draper in Bristol and a cobbler in Norwich, in order to have them expunged of Scotticisms and weeded out of the text before exposing it to polite society. This from a man who was profoundly Scottish and proudly Scottish. But there was economic pressure to Anglicise too. London was where power lay, and so the Scots who went there were anxious to adapt and conform. James Boswell is a typical 18th century Scots aristocrat, doing everything he can to ingratiate himself with the London literati and nobility. Dr. Johnson is a good example of an elitist Englishman, resentful of the Scots' inordinate influence in every sphere of city life, disdainful of their culture and their attempts to acquire his culture. Boswell's description of their first meeting encapsulate the ambience. Mr. Davis mentioned my name and respectfully introduced me to him. I was much agitated, and recollecting his prejudice against the Scotch, of which I had heard much, I said to Davis, "Don't tell him where I come from." "From Scotland," cried Davis roguishly. "Mr. Johnson," said I do indeed come from Scotland, but I cannot help it. I am willing to flatter myself that I meant this as a light pleasantry to soothe and conciliate him, and not as a humiliating abasement at the expense of my country. But however that might be, this speech was somewhat unlucky, for he seized the expression, "come from Scotland," which I used in the sense of being of that country, and retorted, "That, sir, I find, is what a very great many of your countrymen cannot help." This stroke stunned me a good deal, and when we had sat down, I felt myself not a little embarrassed and apprehensive of what might come next. What came next was that Boswell got the name of being Johnson's Scotch cur, becoming, and here I beg your pardon, ladies and gentlemen, to introduce a Scotticism, the classic sook. His father, Lord Auchinleck, like many of the law lords, continued speaking Scots, which he used to good effect when he heard of his son's attachment to Johnson. "Jamie has gane clean gait. Whase tale do you think he's preened himself to noo? A dominie man, an old dominie, will keep it a skill and called it an academy." Boswell's wife was so put out at the sight of her husband grovelling before the Englishman, she remonstrated that she had often seen a bear led by a man, but never till now had she seen a man led by a bear. An indication of the good doctor's insensitivity and his supercilious dismissal of the notion that the Scots possessed any degree of culture at all, are revealed by his remarks, made in obvious wonder and admiration when he visits an innovative school for the handicapped in Edinburgh. "It was pleasing to see one of the most desperate of human calamities capable of so much help. Whatever enlarges hope will exalt courage. After having seen the deaf taught arithmetic in Edinburgh, who would be afraid to cultivate the Hebrides?" Boswell, of course, was so thrilled to Johnson and to English culture that he was all but oblivious to the great lexicographer's faults. He was particularly sensitive about his Scottish accent and frequently rails against the speech of his fellow countrymen in London. Quote, "The common style of company and conversation, the coarse jibes of this hamely company, the fife tongue and the nidries wind address were quite hideous." Contemplating that he may have to go back and live in Scotland to inherit his estates filled him with horror. It would be like yoking a Newmarket winner to a dung cart. Given his linguistic insecurity, any praise or hint of approval from his master felt like manna from heaven, and it's therefore worthy of note in his diary. The following passage is from 1772. On Saturday, March 27th, I introduced him to Sir Alexander MacDonald. Sir Alexander observed, "I've been here correcting several Scotch accents in my friend Boswell. I doubt, sir, if any Scotsman ever attains to a perfect English pronunciation." Johnson, "Why, sir, few of them do, because they do not persevere after acquiring a certain degree in it." Upon another occasion, I talked to him on this subject, having myself taken some pains to improve my pronunciation by the aid of the late Mr. Love of Drury Lane Theatre, when he was a player in Edinburgh, and also of old Mr. Sheridan. Johnson said to me, "Sir, your pronunciation is not offensive." With this concession, I was pretty well satisfied, and let me give my countrymen of North Britain an advice not to aim at absolute perfection in this respect. A small intermixture of provincial peculiarities may perhaps have an agreeable effect. Ladies and gentlemen, the great literary language of the Makars, who produced some of the greatest poetry in Europe between 1450 and 1550 in Scots, reduced to being a provincial peculiarity. This was how far Scots had sunk in the second half of the 18th century. It was to sink even further and be regarded with odium by men who didn't share Boswell's undiscriminating veneration of the English. David Hume felt no personal affinity with England. He felt at home only in Edinburgh or Paris, where he was feted by the intelligentsia, and was forever railing against, quote, "the factious barbarians of London who will hate me because I'm a Scotsman and I'm not a Whig, and despise me because I'm a man of letters." This didn't prevent him following blindly the fashion of the age for Augustan refinement, the attainment of which necessitated the rooting out of all traces of Scottishness from the writing. The balancing act which the Scots of the 18th century made between Scottish and English culture in their society and within the individual produced an almost schizophrenic state of mind among people whose loyalties were constantly stretched in different directions. Alan Ramsay was one of the great poets who revived Scots as a literary language, yet he too was very much a man of his time and sometimes found it difficult to resolve the dichotomy that pulled him in different directions. His son and namesake, Alan Ramsay, the painter, helped found the Select Society in 1754. Adam Smith and David Hume were also members. From its ranks sprang the Society for the English Language, whose initial aim was to promote the correct use of English, and to that effect engaged a Mr. Lee, a person well qualified to teach the pronunciation of the English tongue with propriety and grace. Whereas in the previous century, the terms to describe the language of the Lowlands alternated between English and Scots, as it had done interchangeably since the 16th century, there was now a conscious distinction made between the vernaculars of England and Scotland. As late as the first few decades of the 18th century, schools referred to the class teaching the vernacular as the Scots class or the English class, and the terms wouldn't imply a difference of emphasis. By the middle of the century, however, you have schools starting to refer to the teaching English by the new method, which usually implied that an attempt would be made to teach Southern pronunciation. Heriot's School in the 17th century claims it'll teach the bairns to read and write Scots distinctly, while by the time Edinburgh Academy is founded in the early 19th century, quote, "a proper English articulation and accent is insisted upon in order to remedy a defect in the education of boys in Edinburgh who are suffered to neglect the cultivation of their native tongue and literature during the whole time they attend the grammar school." As you can see by then, English has become so all-powerful that it is deemed proper and the native tongue, while presumably the indigenous vernacular, the actual native tongue, is dismissed almost as a defect. We are now beginning to recognize traits ingraining themselves which persist in our own similarly enlightened age. Numerous books were published in Scotland, which attempted to show by multifarious orthographic devices how English was pronounced in England. Among them were the Edinburgh New Method of Teaching English in 1750, Lingua Britannicae Vera Pronunciato in 1757, the Pronouncing Dictionary of the English Language by John Burns in 1777, and William Scott's A General View of English Pronunciation, published in Edinburgh. This is a typical ad by a teacher, William Noble, intent on exploiting upper-class sensibilities. I will take all imaginable care of the quantity, accent, and manner of expression, by which I hope that the barbarisms so often and so justly complained of here will be properly guarded against. Or Mr. Telfer, lately arrived from London, having studied and taught the English language chiefly for several years, he hopes he shall be able to teach his pupils that pronunciation and accent which are used by the most polite speakers, and great care will be taken that no Scotch be spoken in time of school. One can only smile today when one thinks of men of the stature of Smith and Hume being fashed with trivialities such as the following examples from the book. Scots, a bit bread. English, a bit of bread. Scots, the better of a sleep. English, the better for a sleep. Scots, on the morn. English, on the morrow. Scots, a sore head. English, a headache. Scots, to my bed. English, to bed. Scots, he has got the cold. English, he's got a cold. Scots, where do you stay? English, where do you lodge, live, or dwell? A glance at the two lists will show that the Scottish options are still in use in Scottish English today. Proof of the survival of Scots, even amongst those who consider that they don't speak it. The Anglicisers were perhaps more successful in the long term with words that were unique to Scots. Beattie never regarded them as much of a problem. With respect to broad Scots words, I don't think any caution requisite, as they are easily known and the necessity of avoiding them is obvious. But there were those who resisted. One anecdote concerning John Clerk of Penicuik, later Lord Eldon, relates how the Scot was arguing a Scottish appeal case before the House of Lords. Pleading his client's use of a burn or a water by prescriptive right, Clark's rich Scots ran out, referring to the water hain rin this way for mair nor 40 year. The Chancellor, bemused by Clark's pronunciation, interrupted his oration and inquired in a rather condescending tone, Mr. Clark, do you spell water with 2 T's in Scotland? Clerk, astonished by the man's rudeness, still managed to give better than he got. No, my lord, but we spell Mainers with 4 N's. For some of the judges, their use of Scots was a reaction against a fashion for precious gentility, particularly prevalent in Edinburgh during the fashion for the cult of sensibility, where grown men would weep in public as sentimental works such as Henry Mackenzie's The Man of Feeling were read out. The sensibility of such as the hanging judge, Lord Braxfield, was of a quite different order. During the sedition trials at the turn of the 19th century, the Englishman Margaret claimed that he and his fellow radicals stood in a long line of noble men who were reformers as well, Jesus Christ himself being one of them. Braxfield replied, "Muckle he made of that, he was hingit." Another great Enlightenment figure, Lord Kames, one of my favourites, also a friend of Adam Smith, in his farewell address to the Court of Session when he retired from that august institution in his 80s, his final words to the institution were memorably concise and terse. Fare ye all weel, ye bitches. He was a close friend of Adam Smith. In his time, there was also a brilliant vernacular revival as a counterbalance to the Anglicisation sweeping Scotland. You had Ramsay, Ferguson, and Burns. Burns, fortunately, was enough of his own man to ignore the advice of the literary elite to write solely in English. This is Henry Mackenzie's review. One bar indeed his birth and education have opposed to his fame, the language in which most of his poems are written. If Burns had followed that advice, he would have been just another obscure, stilted versifier like Beattie and Blacklock, instead of one of the world's genuinely popular yet great poets. As an Ayrshirman, I'm always proud to recite Burns, but I decided here, by the shores of the Forth, I would recite an example of the brilliance of the 18th century, fizzing vitality of the poetry especially, in the work of Robert Fergusson. Fergusson was from a Northeast Episcopalian family who was educated in the High School of Dundee, then St Andrews University, and then worked in Edinburgh. And in this poem, Calar Oysters, Fresh Oysters, he praises the arrival of oysters into the city, which were then consumed in the house and in the pubs. And I think it's a brilliant piece of Scots poetry. Calar Oysters. Oh, the waters that can hobble a fishing yawl or salmon cobble, and can reward the fisher's trouble, or south or north. There's nane sae spacious and sae noble as Firth of Forth. In her the skate and codlin sail, the eel fu supple wags her tail, wi' herring, fluke, and mackerel and whitens dainty, their spinel shanks the lobsters trail, wi' partins plenty. Aldrich's sons blithe faces wear, September's merry month is near, that brings in Neptune's calar cheer, new oysters fresh, the halesomest and nicest gear o' fish or flesh. Oh then, we needna gie a plaque for donnerin mountebank or quack. What other drugs sae boldly crack and spread sick notions as gar their feckless patients tack their stinking potions. Come, pre, frail man, for gin thou art sick, the oyster is a rare cathartic that every doctor his patient gat lick to cure his ails. Whether you hae the heed or hair take, it aye prevails. Ye tipplers, open all your posies, ye who are fast wi' plucky noses, fling o'er your crags sufficient doses, you'll thole a hunner, to fleg awa your simmer roses, and nothin' under. When big as Burns the gutters rin, gin ye hae catched a drookit skin, to lucky Middlemas sloup in and sit foo snug, our oysters in a drama gin or haddock lug. When all St Giles at 8 o'clock, gars merchant loons their shoppies lock, there we adjourn wi' hearty folk to birl our bodles and get where we to crack our joke and clear our noddles. Thank you. All the Scots writers, however, engaged in a balancing act between the two cultures. But it was only when the poets Ramsay, Ferguson and Burns wrote in Scots that the balance tilted from precious gentility towards greatness. Proof, if any, is required that Scots still held the heart, if not the mind, of the intelligentsia of the period. I'd like to conclude a concluding section by talking a little about Scotland's trading and cultural links with Europe, which predated the union with England by several hundred years, especially this part of the world, here in the coastal boroughs of Fife and up the coast. We often think of the 18th century and the slave trade is mentioned and the trade with the Americas. But here on the east coast of Scotland, for example, the Scottish staple port in the Netherlands, which was in Fera and before that in Bruges, was still on the go in Adam Smith's time until the end of the 18th century. So trade between Fife and the Low Countries was ongoing. And there was a huge intellectual exchange too. We know that Adam Smith made disparaging remarks about the teaching at Oxford University compared to Glasgow. But coming especially from this part of the country, here are known many who are more likely to go to the universities in the fellow Calvinist nation of the Netherlands for a year or two, to Leiden, Utrecht and Groningen. Scholars today recognise this interchange also as crucial in the origins of the Scottish Enlightenment. Smith's friend Hutton was at Leiden, for example. But probably the greatest debt the Scots owe the Dutch is in the development of Scots law. The man known as the father of Scots law, James Dalrymple, Viscount Stair, arrived as a political refugee in Holland in 1682 and remained at the University of Leiden until 1688 before taking his teachings back to Scotland. Utrecht and Leiden also exerted a huge influence on Scots medicine, with many Scots studying under the great Herman Boerhaave and then founding the Edinburgh Medical School on the model supplied by Leiden. Archibald Pitcairn and Sir Robert Sibbald, for example, were involved in the creation of the Royal College of Physicians in 1681. They were the catalyst for the rapid improvement in the teaching of the subject in Scotland when Edinburgh replaced Leiden as the medical metropolis of the world. Most of the great figures of the Scottish Enlightenment were taught by people who'd experienced the thriving European intellectual milieu of the Dutch universities in that period. Indeed, such was the hold of Leiden on the Scottish imagination that several famous writers have set parts of their novels there, from Robert Louis Stevenson's Katrina to John Buchan's John Burnet of Barnes. An example of the penetration of the Scots, literally hundreds of boys only at this time, including Boswell. Such was the penetration of the Scots into the Dutch system at that time, that, for example, the great Herman Boerhaave collaborated with John Clerk of Penicuik that I mentioned earlier in creating an original piece of music, of classical music, about the Darien scheme, about the unsuccessful Scottish colony in Darien, where the music was written by Clerk of Penicuik and the words in Latin were written by Herman Boerhaave. An image that I've got from that period, I did a programme about the Scots in the Low Country about 2 years ago, and a historian in St Andrews giving me this unforgettable image of the Bishop of St Andrews literally walking down the path from the Bishop's Palace next to the castle in St Andrews, down the path to the harbour where he had his own ship to go on a shopping expedition to Bruges. That's how common it was to go back and forward between Fife at that period. And if you see in places like Dysart or Curis or right up the East Neuk, all these beautiful red pan tiles on the roofs and the Corby Step gables, again a Dutch influence. The Scots word pan tile comes from the Dutch word for a tile, pan. Wealthy Scots merchants used them for prestigious buildings in the 17th century in places like Curis, but as they got cheaper, they became widespread and reached a peak in the 19th century. And for that, we have to thank William Adam from the famous family of architects who started up the first pan-tile works in Scotland in 1714, here at Linktown of Abbots Hall in Kircaldy. Further afield, just a couple of stories. Christopher Smout, the great English historian who's written great works on Scottish history, he told me the story of the Scottahandle, the timber trade in Norway as being where the Scots took over from the Dutch as the main foreign nation dealing in Norwegian timber, and how friendships grew up between the two countries. And he told me a story of a skipper from Kirkcaldy who arrived in the woods near Stavanger and asked if they could load up his ship with timber as quickly as possible because his wife at home in Kirkcaldy was due to deliver their baby in the next few days. And the family in Norway knew the Fife family. They'd travelled across and visited each other. So the Norwegian wife prepared and cooked this special fortifying porridge with dried fruit and with herbs and spices that to send to her friend in Kirkcaldy. And the story is that they loaded up the hold of the ship with the timber. They put the big pot of porridge in the bottom of the hold. They rowed it in a big hap, in a big blanket. They got a fair wind across the North Sea, and the porridge was still warm when I arrived in Kirkcaldy. Further afield, Danzig and the Baltic. Danzig, Gdansk was a big Scottish important city at that time. So many Scots boys from Fife and Angus took ship in places like Dundee to Danzig, Gdansk, and then became peddlers in the countryside of Poland in the 17th century, that the word Scot In German, Schotte was the word for a peddler and a Scot, and it was the same in Polish. And we were so ubiquitous in that period that German mothers wanting to punish their children would say, "Warte bis der Schotte kommt." You wait until the Scot comes and takes you away, because we were so ubiquitous. Even further afield, up in Russia, the two major cities, St. Petersburg and Moscow, especially St. Petersburg, was a stronghold of Scottish Jacobite exiles who Farquharson became a mathematician from Aberdeen University, was a brilliant advisor to Catherine the Great, for example. Her main architect was a man called Cameron, who built the Cameron Gallery in Tsarskoye Selo. And another wee five connection that I certainly won't go into in any depth here in a kirk was there was a branch of the Beggars' Benison, which was a hellfire club started up in Anstruther and took off around the British Empire and into Europe as well. And they had a branch in St. Petersburg. So these are some examples of East Coast of Scotland connections with Europe. But finally, I think while we rightly celebrate a man who is much more than an icon of capitalism, I think it's only fair to remind us of a more recent Fife connection to that other strong thing in human history, especially in the middle of the 20th century and back especially in 1917. That is, from capitalism to communism. I made a series on the history of the Scottish miners back in the 1980s. And I remember interviewing Rab Smith, a councillor, communist councillor from Lunfinnans. And Rab literally told me the story of the Fife miners in Methil looking longingly at the port and hoping that Soviet ships would arrive to begin the revolution in Fife. And it was such a strong tradition in Fife. For example, the last communist member of Parliament is as late as 1950, and Willie Gallagher. And my uncle Tommy from Bohill was one of his right-hand men and stood as a communist candidate in Bohill. And he was chuffed to hear that the local priest had condemned him in the church. Two men stood as councillors, not as calling themselves communists, but everyone knew they were communist, one from Ballingery and one from Logelly, until about 10 years ago, where they were known in the council as the Hammer and the Sickle. A wee story to draw to a conclusion about this tradition that links Scots and Scottish history. My mother's earliest memory was being taught the words of the red flag during the 1926 general strike in Bohill by her uncle in Bohill. When I was at Kilmarnock Academy in the 1966-69, I was able to take a third modern language, which was Russian. And I went on a school trip to Moscow. And being foreigners, we were allowed to jump the queue to see Lenin's embalmed body in Red Square. And as I was going through, passing the amazing sight of Vladimir Ilyich Lenin's embalmed body, my eye caught written in Cyrillic script on the wall of the tomb the name MacLean. And when I came out, I said to my teacher, "Was that MacLean written on the wall there in Cyrillic script?" And he says, "Yes, that was John MacLean, the great Red Clydeside revolutionary, whom Lenin appointed as British consul after the revolution in 1917. And about 20 years after that incident, I was giving a talk on Scots in Linlithgow, and there was the usual steering debate about it. But at the end of it, an old lady doddered up and said, "I want to shake your hands and thank you for what you're doing for the culture and the language." And she went and I said, "Lovely," and I signed the book and she went away. And as she went away, the organizer of the event said, "You know who that is?" And I said, "No." And he said, "That's Nan Milton, the daughter of the great John MacLean." MacLean was famous for uttering the words, "All hail a Scottish Workers' Republic." And after the obscene excesses of the King's coronation witnessed recently, this grandson of Fife and Ayrshire miners believes that that is an appropriate and resounding phrase for me to end on. Thank you for listening.
Well, that was a journey to Gdansk and Moscow via St. Petersburg and Bow Hill. I had missed the Fife connection and I apologise for that. It's been quite an afternoon and we're not finished yet because we're delighted that Elizabeth and Mark are now going to give us their second set of songs. So I'm assuming the camera's all set and we can just go. So if you'd welcome Mark and Elizabeth back.
The second set is going to be all Burns songs, so I'm hoping you know a few, if not all of them. John Anderson, I know, John, when we were first acquaint, your locks were like the rain, and your was burnt. Your brow is bent, your locks are like the snow, but blessings on the frosty pane. John Anderson, my John. John Anderson, my John, we cried together, and mony a canty day, John, we tottered, John, hand in hand we'll go, and sleep together at the foot. John Anderson, my John. That's the war excitement, the earth, the wife, and all. The deal's a war, the deal's a war, the deal's a war with excitement. He danced a war, he danced a war. He danced a war with excitement. We'll matter and brooding, we'll sing, dance and rejoice. But money brought back to the men, the black deals, they danced a war with excitement. The deal's a war, the deal's a war, the deal's a war with excitement. He's danced a war, he's danced a war. He's danced a war with excitement. There's three some reels, there's four some reels, there's hornpipes, and there's eight. With the eye of the sense that come to the land. The deal's a war, the deal's a war, the deal's a war with excitement. He's danced a war, he's danced a war. He's danced a war with excitement. My boy. Hark the mavis sing, My body and down my clear side through the hazel spread are the waves that sweetly glide to the moon say clearly. Ah, the hours, the hours, come my body. Fair and lovely as art, thou hast stolen my heart. What can I but cannot part my body dear? Ah, the hours where the Time I do that song, I make it faster and faster, and I can never get the words out. So it's a lesson to me. So the last song we'll be performing is Auld Lang Syne, and we would love for you to join in. But before that, we're heading back to Mozart, and we're doing a duet from Don Giovanni. And little did you know, Don Giovanni has been in the audience this whole time.
Io canterò tua sorte. Son più forte, non son più forte. Vieni, immaginare la mano. Vorrei e non vorrei. Ma mi dirai di sì. Partiamo io da qui. Forte, non sono più forte. Andiamo, andiamo. Andiamo. Andiamo, andiamo, le nostra, dove gente amor.
for Don Giovanni. This is Peter Thompson and my father. So,
Thank you so much. They didn't warn me either, which is why I choked up, but that was magnificent. So it remains to me to say a few words of thanks, but we did promise you an afternoon of culture. I don't think I realised when Roger asked me to do this that we'd go on a journey from Jane Austen's Emma to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, from Mozart to Beethoven, from Adam Smith and David Hume, Boswell and Johnson, and last but not least, of course, Robert Ferguson and Rabbie Burns. And what a magnificent set of Rabbie Burns songs that was. I would like to think that if Adam Smith were here, as he was christened 300 years ago this week in this very building, he would have recognised much of what we talked about, much of what we've heard, and would have been proud to have been celebrated in his hometown of Kircaldy. So all I need to say now is a big thank you to you, the audience, to Professor Michael Brown from Aberdeen, to Billy, and to Elizabeth and to Mark. And finally, to Roger, the unsung hero sitting quietly in the background. I should probably have put you first, Roger, but I don't think people probably understand the amount of work and effort that goes into putting together a programme as he has done over these 2 days, drawing on every connection, every professor, every person he knew that would be able to contribute to this magnificent programme. And that's on top of everything else that I know he's involved in. So thank you very much indeed for coming. I do hope you've enjoyed your afternoon. I hope some of you might be partaking in the events in the Adam Smith Theatre over the weekend. But to say one final thank you to our 4 contributors this afternoon. Thank you.